Hey, welcome back to Tech Tip Tuesday. Today we're going to be talking about naming units in quilt patterns. What do I mean by that? We're talking about calling it like a corner unit or a side unit or a star unit, something like those lines, giving it a name so that when you have to refer to that unit in subsequent steps, you refer to the name instead of saying the unit from step 3 or something along those lines, right? So why would you want to do this? Well, first of all, it's a lot easier to remember where you're at when there's actual distinct names associated with each one of these things. And we're going to talk about some guidelines to help make that more valuable. Hey, welcome back to Tech Tip Tuesday. Today, we're going to be talking about naming units in quilt patterns. So let's talk a little bit about why you might want to do that. Well, first of all, it's easy to remember where you're at in the pattern because you can section off your pattern into distinct pieces that are for each unit, right? So you can make the corner unit here and the side unit here. And when you're working through that pattern and you're looking for where you're at, if you're picking up the pattern after a couple of weeks of not having time to work on it or something along those lines, you can remember easier like, hey, I'm in the corner unit section, rather than I'm on step 23 of 54 and I just have to remember those numbers. That's really hard. The other reason is that it's much easier to find the pieces that you're looking for when a step says something like grab 4 corner units and 4 side units and a center unit or something along those lines, rather than grab 4 of the units from step 3. If it says that, you've got to go back and remember exactly what unit you made in step 3 and then go find it amongst all of the pieces that you've got laid out in your work area for the quilt that you're making. It's just much easier if you're looking for a specific unit that is named rather than associated with the step. And we're going to talk about some tips about how to name these units so that part of the process is even easier. So how do you go about doing this? Well, first of all, when you're naming a unit, some things that you want to keep in mind is that you want to choose names that are descriptive of the blocks. So on the diagram on the left here, you can see that I've got basically a 9-patch block that we're going to sew together 3 different units in 3 rows and then sew all those rows together. So you've got 9 patches across the quilt, and there's a variety of different patches there, and they're composed of multiple shapes, right? We've got HSTs and flying geese that these kind of subunits are made out of. And so the natural way that I would suggest naming this is by separating these into corner units, which obviously go at the corner of your blocks, and then side units, which would go at, the middle sections on the sides. And then in the center there, we just have a square in this particular instance, but you could have another unit in there that you might call a center unit. I kind of alluded to that earlier, but that makes logical sense, right? The corner units go in the corner and the side units go on the side. That is going to be really intuitive for your reader, and it makes it easier for them to just follow your pattern, which is the whole point of this. The other thing you want to keep in mind is using short names. You don't want to talk about the corner star point purple unit or something along those lines. This got like 6 words in it. That's too much. That's too much for anyone to remember. And oftentimes the longer the name, the more they just kind of blend together, which defeats the purpose of doing this, right? We want to have distinct units that we're referencing with different names. So keep it short. The shorter, the better. Short, quick phrases, those are the things that are going to stick in your reader's mind. The third thing I want to suggest is use a name that feels natural. Don't use something that is like, hang on, what are you talking about? I guess I kind of get the name, but that's not what I would call it and it doesn't really make sense. So for instance, if we called that corner unit a chevron unit instead, okay, it kind of looks like a chevron, but you know what? The side unit also kind of looks like a chevron as well. So that's kind of an example of something that doesn't really feel natural. So try to stay away from that, even if it's not incorrect, right? We could definitely call that corner unit a chevron. We could also call it an arrowhead. We could call it cat ears. If you look on the diagonal, it kind of looks like a little cat head, right? There's many things that we could name this. And depending on the pattern that you're working in, some things may be more appropriate than others. They may feel more natural than others, but keep that in mind. Don't use something that doesn't really feel intuitive. It doesn't make sense to your reader automatically. You want to use a name that's descriptive of the shape that you're referring to, and that is nice and short and easy to remember. That's the goal here. So let's talk about some don'ts, some things to avoid. The first is using letter codes. Now, this is true most of the time. I will give you an example when this would be okay, but a lot of times when I'm teching patterns, I will see an ABA flying geese, or an ABC flying geese, or an AB HST, or a CD HST, or an ABA square and a square block, something along those lines, right? It makes sense, right? Generally, those letters are referring to the fabrics that you're using them. So you would have, a piece of A fabric, a piece of B fabric, a piece of C fabric. Kind of intuitively makes sense. But the problem with this is that if you've got a bunch of different varieties of these things, you're going to end up with a bunch of names that are all very similar, right? ABA, ABB, BCB. Like, how are you going to differentiate between those things when you're just kind of skimming a pattern and then going to work on a quilt and remember which is which? It's going to take you a hot second to kind of think through and figure out which fabrics you have and what the correct order of the letter code is, especially when you get into these ones where like order matters, permutations matter, right? An ABB is different from an AAB, or an ABA has all the same fabrics, but the format maybe indicates which pieces of the flying geese are which fabric. You feel smart when you're putting this kind of scheme into your quilt pattern, but I kid you not, this is like the most confusing thing to keep track of when you're reading a pattern as a tech editor and also as a quilter. So try to avoid using those letter codes. The only time where I've seen this be beneficial is if you're making like 8 different varieties of flying geese and you're making them all exactly the same way. You're just making it with a bunch of different fabrics in there. Sometimes it's okay to use a letter code there, but I would encourage you to try and keep it short, right? So if you're pairing all of your fabrics with a background fabric, just use the non-background fabric letter to indicate what it is, right? So an A flying geese, a B flying geese, a C flying geese, something along those lines. If you are not doing that, maybe it's an AB flying geese and a BC flying geese or something like that. Again, if you've got literally 16 or so different varieties, that probably makes sense. There's not really a good way to differentiate otherwise because you've just got so many varieties of the same thing. But if you only have 2 or 3, try to give those distinct names rather than using letter codes. It's going to be much more clear for your reader. The other really important thing to avoid is using cutesy names. Now, what do I mean by that? I have seen in patterns where something's called a warbler unit or something crazy like that, right? Sometimes there are names for different units and quilt blocks, right? Snail trail. That's a very traditional quilt block. A lot of people don't necessarily know that that's the name for it anymore though, right? It used to be very traditional quilting, right? Everybody knew all of the basic quilt blocks. That's not really true anymore because you got a lot of young, newer quilters that kind of learned off of YouTube and things like that through the pandemic, and they don't necessarily know what a broken dishes block is, right? So know your audience. Sometimes that's okay, sometimes it's not. But if you're using one of those more obscure names for the unit or block that you're building up, sometimes calling it by the name is not the best option, right? You want to use something a little bit more intuitive to the audience that you're working with. If you write more for traditional quilters, it's probably okay to call it a broken dishes unit or a card trick block or something like that, right? People are going to recognize those names. But if you write for kind of a younger crowd, a more modern audience, chances are your reader's not going to know what that is. And so that's going to be a cutesy name that you're going to give to a unit or a block that they're going to be like, I don't know what this is. Like, that doesn't make sense. It's not natural to me for it to be called that. And so it's just going to be this like extraneous thing that you name that they're not going to have to associate a new name with that block. And there are some ways around that, right? If you explain it in the intro and you say, hey, this is a traditional quilt block. This is the card trick block. It's not well known, but people have been making this for 100 years and give it a little bit of a history, then it's probably okay to use it because you now given them context to why it's named that way. But just handing it that name and moving on is going to feel really awkward. And then it's going to be foreign to them and difficult to remember as a result of that. It's going to be no better than saying, use the unit from step 3, which is what we want to avoid, right? So name your blocks, name your units. That's really helpful for the flow of a quilt pattern and makes the writing of it easier, right? You have less numbers and steps and things that sound very similar to each other to keep track of. But make sure that when you're picking a name for it, it's something that's intuitive. Now, things like flying geese and HSTs, use those names, right? Everybody knows what a flying geese is. Everybody knows what an HST is. But for stuff that's more complicated than that or is multiple shapes coming together, think about the name that you're giving that unit. And I highly encourage giving that unit a name because it does make the pattern a lot easier to follow. Alrighty, that's all I've got for today. If you found this video helpful, make sure you like and subscribe, and I will see you back here next week for another episode of Tech Tip Tuesday. See ya!